quickly. Settle down.
Since the dawn of warfare, commanders have created elite units for special battlefield missions. Such units with superior weapons and equipment have won victories over much larger regular forces from the time of King David until the invention of the arquebus matchlock gun and mounted cavalry. These new technologies changed the scope of war. Because of the increased firepower, no longer could a company of elite fighters, through individual bravery and superior skill, win a war. Massive firepower now dominated the battlefield. The settlement of North America created a need for small elite units to protect the villages and farms of the New World, the vast unexplored frontiers which far exceeded the capability of any European army of the day. Small groups of young men who knew how to live, shoot, and fight in the wilderness were recruited by local communities or European governments to stop the Indian attacks and take war to their villages. The earliest of these were Church's Rangers in the late 1600s and Rogers Rangers of the 1750s. In these and many other cases, tough men were led by shrewd Americans to out-Indian the Indians and use stealth, intelligence, and fighting skill to find the signs of war parties, track them down, and ambush them on their own ground. These early Rangers set the pattern of what Rangers always have done. They patrol and they raid. That will never change. The entire American Revolution was an insurgency against the most powerful empire in the world. Washington's Continental Army eventually fought as well as the British regulars, but his small force won by concentrating on smaller portions of the occupying force and conducting guerrilla operations against the Indians and scattered groups from Canada to the Carolinas. While both sides used conventional forces, much of the 8 years were fought by men operating from the shadows. In 1823, the Austin colony in Mexican Texas formed the Texas Rangers to protect the frontier and take the war on horseback to the Comanches. They were effective in protecting Texans against the Indians, bandits, and still serve as elite law enforcement to this very day. They can patrol, investigate, and fight. The American Civil War saw the rebirth of elite special operation forces. In the South, partisans were small units of conventional forces organized by regular forces commanders for operations behind enemy lines. The 1862 Partisan Ranger Act, passed by the Confederate Congress, approved the formation of these units and gave them legitimacy. John Singleton Mosby formed a partisan unit that was very effective in tying down federal forces behind Union lines in Northern Virginia. Mosby's partisan Rangers focused their attention on harassing the Yankee invaders and soon emerged as a real and constant threat to the Union Army. These irregulars attacked Union pickets and small, vulnerable groups of Union men. They intercepted Union supplies, cut communication lines, destroyed rail cars and railroad tracks, carried out surprise raids, and often donned blue uniforms to invade Yankee camps. These tactics frightened and demoralized Union soldiers. Mosby so defied Union troops stationed in Virginia over a 2-year period that they called him the Gray Ghost. By the end of 1863, Northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley became known as Mosby's Confederacy. The guerrilla war took on its own shade and character in the Western theater of operations. It emerged early on at its most intense in Missouri. It immediately became savage and barbaric, fought mainly by bushwhackers who behaved more like outlaws. Men such as William Clark Quantrell and William T. Bloody Bill Anderson carried out raids which amounted to little more than murder sprees. In 1863, Quantrill killed 200 men and boys in the Unionist town of Lawrence, Kansas. And in 1864, Anderson led the famous Centralia Massacre, in which his men, including a young Jesse James, pulled 24 unarmed Union soldiers off a train and executed them. Unionist jayhawkers would post an equal threat to Midwestern society as they preyed on secessionist families and attempted to wipe out the Confederate bushwhackers. There were also deep raids by irregular forces. Much like modern special operation forces, they were given specific missions to destroy logistical hubs, railroad bridges, and other strategic targets to support the greater mission of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. John Hunt Morgan led raids into Kentucky as well. In his last raid, he violated orders by going across the Ohio River and raiding in Ohio and Indiana. This long raid diverted thousands of Union troops. He captured and paroled nearly 6,000 soldiers, destroyed bridges and fortifications, and ran off livestock. As the Indians of the West became increasingly pressured and surrounded by settlers and the United States military after the Civil War, they continued the fight in small elite bands sent to raid and ambush. The U.S. Army recruited many Indians to serve as scouts against rival tribes. These Indian scouts brought in Geronimo and serve as the lineage and symbol of U.S. Special Forces to this day. From the dawn of the 20th century until the beginnings of World War II, the U.S. Marine Corps served as the special operators of U.S. diplomacy around the world. First, they would deploy from warships to protect embassy personnel and citizens from unrest. Then they would identify allies from the native population and train them to take over stability operations from the Marines so they could get back on their boats. This happened in Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, China, and many other hotspots around the globe. Following the efforts of the U.S. Army to stabilize the western frontier for hundreds of years, the U.S. Marine Corps became the American experts at small wars. The rapid victories of the Germans, Italians, and Japanese over vast populations around the world during World War II forced the Allies to conduct commando operations, as well as arm, train, and lead guerrilla forces in occupied land to resist their occupiers. The United States formed the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, to parachute operators behind enemy lines, to sabotage railroads, bridges, and assassinate leaders. They also brought weapons and training for local insurgent groups behind the lines. These secret operators were expected to be combat multipliers. They would train and lead local guerrillas to fight and aid their own liberation at low cost and with few Allied troops involved. The job of the OSS was to enable occupied peoples to help liberate themselves. While most of the efforts of the OSS in World War II centered on France and Europe, a number were parachuted into Burma to work alongside Merrill's marauders to defeat the Japanese deep in the jungles of Burma. They raised, armed, trained, and led the Kashin Scouts in raids and ambushes until the end of the war in the Pacific, tying down thousands of Japanese troops and destroying roads, bridges, rails, and supply dumps. Other OSS operators were inserted into French Indochina to help the Viet Minh in their struggles against the Japanese and the French Vichy forces allied with the Germans. They assisted the Viet Minh leader not only in successfully defeating the Japanese, but also provided encouragement for the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence in September 1945. The stage was set for the renewal of the Indochina War when the French returned to reoccupy their region following the end of World War II. That struggle to re-establish French colonial control got mixed in with the Cold War and directly involved the United States. The overwhelming destructive power of both sides deterred each side from directly taking on the other. But soon a series of proxy wars broke out in Central America and Southeast Asia. Conventional forces were not very effective in combating guerrillas fighting on their home turf. a new generation of unconventional soldiers was called for. The origin of America's commitment of special operations troops to Indochina can be traced to a warm October day in 1961, in the first year of John Kennedy's brief presidency. President Kennedy had come to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, primarily to review the 82nd Airborne and get a feel for the power of an American division with all its might and in all its glory. The young commander-in-chief also had another more pressing reason for the visit to the base. He had also come to witness what the Army's newly created small elite fighting force could do. This force was the Army's Special Forces. Standing on the tarmac with his company was a young paratrooper, Ollie Fitzwater.
Now I'm down there standing at attention with the 82nd Airborne Division, all out on Pope Air Force Base, and the President's driving by checking us out. And at 19 years old, here's John Kennedy going by, and everybody's supposed to be staring straight ahead in the back of the head and in front of you, and everybody, the pride that we had for him, and what, you know, I was very proud. Being an Irishman, we got an Irish commander-in-chief, I'm happy as I can be. This last one was a bad thing, but anyway, you're supposed to be looking straight ahead, and everybody with the pride of who it was like we couldn't be, you know, nobody will see us if you turn your head. And, you know, you can see all kind of heads turning. There he comes, there he comes. Yeah, see him, let's see him. And I wrote and told my father, I said, Dad, I said, I'm not supposed to do it. You're supposed to be looking straight ahead. But I looked up, and Jack Kennedy's, we had eye contact. And to me, that was, oh, it couldn't get any better. 19 years old and a kid that was almost in jail. Now I'm looking at the President of the United States.
It was a proud moment for Fitzwater's Special Forces comrades. They wanted to demonstrate that pride to their president with the headgear of their brotherhood. In the Army of the 50s and early 60s, distinctive uniforms for elite troops was strictly forbidden. But on the 12th of October, green berets of every variety were taken from their hiding places and placed on freshly shaved heads. On this day, for the first time at an official function, the Special Forces troops wore the cherished symbol of their brotherhood, the Green Beret. Around the world, the Green Beret was soon recognized as a symbol of a highly trained and resourceful soldier. From that day forward, the Army's Special Forces would be known by friend and foe alike by their distinctive headgear. It wasn't surprising that JFK would place his blessings upon the Maverick Special Operations Unit. To Kennedy, they were glamorous, and these were the most glamorous days of Camelot. But glamour was not what Kennedy was looking for in this new fighting force. Special Forces had the potential to do important things that he wanted to accomplish. He had outlined those things in January of that year in his inaugural speech, which was a call to arms for the free world.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today at home and around the world.
The Army's Special Forces became the spearhead to defend that vision of superpower foreign policy, a steel bolt to strike swiftly and silently on Third World battlefields where the Cold War was heating up. In the late 50s and early 60s, the Cold War was nowhere hotter than in Southeast Asia. The French army had been in Indochina since the middle of the 19th century. The regular army and the legendary legionnaires exerted its considerable power to enforce the authority of the colonial government, extinguishing countless acts of rebellion intended to destabilize the French hold on the region. That grip began to loosen in May of 1940, when Hitler unleashed upon the Low Countries and France blitzkrieg.
For the Führer, this was the greatest prize he had yet captured. In a matter of days, the German army was rolling through the French countryside toward Paris. Germany's traditional enemy now lay at the feet of the gloating Nazi Superman.
After 6 weeks of fighting, the British army was thrown into the sea, and France, under World War I hero General Henri-Philippe Pétain, signed an armistice in the same train where Germany had been forced to lay down its arms in 1918. Pétain was to head a French government in southern France, wholly dependent on and collaborating with Germany. Early in 1940, Ho Chi Minh returned from Paris to Vietnam to become the leading figure of the Indochinese Communist Party and its military arm, the Viet Minh. This military force was formed to fight the French troops in Southeast Asia, but soon was confronted by another more dangerous foe.
Out of this meeting between two unscrupulous warrior nations, bent on destruction of the existing world, came an agreement that Germany would not interfere with Japan's designs on Indochina and Thailand.
On August 30th, 1940, the Matsuka-Henry Pact was signed by the puppet Vichy government and the Empire of Japan. This pact permitted the Japanese to station troops in French Indochina. The French colonial administration now was merely window dressing for the Japanese army. To Ho Chi Minh, it made no difference as to who the occupying army was. They were still forcing their rule upon his people. Ho had preached national independence, and now was the time for his nationalist army to strike a blow for that independence. With the help of arms from the U.S. and training support from the Office of Strategic Services, better known as the OSS, he invited all the region's revolutionary forces to unite under his command in the fight against the occupying armies of Japan and France.
The first involvement of the United States military in what became Vietnam really began during World War II. An organization known as the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was developed to help the various occupied countries that had been taken over by the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese. The idea was to bring in operatives, specialized secret organizations to go behind enemy lines, to contact those who would resist their occupiers, to help train them, to help give leadership, weapons, and even lead them into combat if necessary.
For 3 bloody years, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh led a no-holds-barred fight against the Japanese in Southeast Asia. The death toll on both sides was appalling. Far away from the jungle battles, a death blow was struck against the Japanese Empire that brought the fighting to an end. On September 3, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, Japan surrendered to the Allies. But even before the ink was dry on the surrender document, the groundwork for a new conflict was being laid in Southeast Asia. On that same day, hundreds of thousands of people jammed the boulevards and streets of downtown Hanoi. They had traveled in oppressive heat from distant villages for the great day. Banners and flowers adorned the buildings. Flags fluttered in the occasional warm breezes. All faces turned toward the platform erected in Ba Dinh Square, a large park near the French residential quarter. A frail-looking wisp of a man advanced to the microphone. "All men are created equal," he declared, as all of Hanoi listened. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He paused and then elaborated. This immortal statement, he explained, was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. In a broader sense, this means all the peoples on earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. The American Declaration of Independence ends with a pledge taken by all its signers. And, for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Ho Chi Minh's version of the final pledge encompassed not just the signers, but the whole Vietnamese people. The entire people of Vietnam, Ho declared, are determined to mobilize all their spiritual and physical strength to sacrifice their lives and property in order to safeguard their independence and liberty. Days earlier, Ho Chi Minh and his advisors had been laboring to recall as much of Jefferson's language as they could. Ho had memorized the opening lines of the Declaration when he visited the United States as a menial laborer on a tramp steamer before World War I. But his memory had faded. He wondered if one of the American intelligence officers serving in Vietnam could help. During World War II, James Patty headed the Vietnam mission of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the precursor of the CIA. During the summer and fall of 1945, Major Patty, along with Brigadier General Philip Gallagher and Captain Ferris, observed Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh Party. For Patty, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, not a starry-eyed revolutionary or a flaming radical. I felt he could be trusted as an ally against the Japanese, Patty recalled. I saw that his ultimate goal was to attain American support for the cause of a free Vietnam. But the French had other ideas.
The Cold War in its 40 years had many hot spots. Korean War, Angola, many of the fights all over the globe. But the very largest one of the conflicts between the First and Second World was in Vietnam. It was a continuation of wars that had been going on for thousands of years in Cochin China, and the Chinese and the Southeast Asian peoples. Specifically in French Indochina, in the colonial empire of the French, up into World War II, when the most recent occupiers had been the Japanese. In 1945, when the Japanese were defeated, they surrendered, then the French colonial empire came back. What resulted was the French Indochina War between the Viet Minh and the Communists against the French.
Viet Cong tactics were closely patterned after those successfully practiced by the Chinese Communists. Well-trained, well-equipped guerrillas, backed by political commissars and agitators, struck out. They terrorized the cities, sabotaged rails and transportation, blew up bridges, attacked the villages, and melted back into the jungle.
In Paris, General Charles de Gaulle was anxious to restore French sovereignty in Indochina. To that end, he sent a 70,000-man expeditionary corps under the command of General Philippe Francois-Marie Leclerc to regain control of the Asian colony. Leclerc made some effort to compromise with Ho Chi Minh, but in the end, the Viet Minh once again picked up arms and the long war in Vietnam began. The French attempt to reassert control of its Asian empire proved to be a costly and futile exercise. For 8 years, France attempted to subdue the stubborn coalition of communist guerrillas and Vietnamese nationalists who vowed to expel all foreigners from their country. The First Indochina War was no war to win the hearts and minds of the people. It was a brutal war of attrition. French losses in the war totaled 89,879. Viet Minh losses exceeded 500,000. In spite of their courage, France's climactic battle for Southeast Asia at Dien Bien Phu is considered a classic example of how not to wage war. In November of 1953, France foolishly deployed the majority of its forces in a vast basin, totally surrounded by jungle-clad hills held by the enemy Viet Minh. All winter, undetected by French commanders preoccupied with minor ground skirmishes, the enemy advanced. The Viet Minh covered the hills with hundreds of cannon and tons of ordnance carried on their backs up the steep slopes. To deliver the killing blow, tens of thousands of men infiltrated the hillside, placing the French base under constant rifle fire. From the beginning, the French lacked sufficient manpower and equipment to do more than hold on. Yet the fighting dragged on through the spring of 1954.
The climactic struggle for Dien Bien Phu enters its second month with airborne reinforcements shuttled to the beleaguered garrison, where paratroopers drop to a fate that remains in the balance. The picked contingent hits the ground and goes into action immediately with machine gun and mortar fire.
The men fought until there was no more ammunition, no more bodies to absorb the relentless shrapnel raining from the skies above. On May 8, 1954, the fortress fell. 8,000 French legionnaires were dead. The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of the French War.
With the end of the colonial empire period, Vietnam was divided into two zones, which became known as the North and South Vietnam. The dividing line became a demilitarized zone between these two sections. The North became communist, and the South became, well, an oligarchy. And so the struggle between these two for hegemony, trying to get together as one nation, set the stage for what became known as the American War or the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the United States military had ever been involved in. The closest would have been the 250 years or so of conflict with the Native Americans, the Indians, on the frontier, because it was a guerrilla war, a very large one. In fact, it was a smaller part of the Cold War, or 40 Years' War. A war between the first world of capitalist nations versus the second world of communist nations fighting over the hearts and minds of the third world. This third world were countries that had recently been liberated or were free from colonial empires following World War II. They were finding their way at the same time when you had this big polar war between the first and second worlds. The third world was trying to find its way, economically, politically, and socially. So what happened was the first and second world, while they both had atomic weapons, they chose not to use them for the destruction of the planet. And so in order to control the whole planet, then they had to fight for the hearts and minds of those in the third world.
For ground operations, the U.S. needed to develop a new kind of warrior. In the late 1950s, the United States began to provide personnel to aid South Vietnam in its war with the North. These were men of a new special forces trained to operate in Eastern Europe.
These are guys who can put it together with good state of mind, and they're smart, and they're able to put the two together. I think that's, yeah, it takes a special kind of guy.
The old concept of a Special Forces warrior as fire-breathing commando had to be rethought. The new Special Forces warrior had to be politically and psychologically sensitive to the environment in which he was operating.
The officers need to understand. They need to go to school and understand the culture that they're within. They need to be able to recognize things that might not play well, the way you treat villages, the way you act. I mean, you may be thinking that you're being polite, you're really not. Those sort of things that the officers need to know. I don't think the enlisted men really do need to know that. From a special forces point of view, though, they do need to know that, and they do know that, and they did know that in Vietnam. That's all those famous pictures that I guess was Life magazine did of Vernon Gillespie in 1962 and 63. You've probably seen them playing with the children of the Montagnards. This is the sort of things they were taught to do, and they did it very well. So Special Forces, and Special Forces still does that. That's why we have special forces groups that are devoted to one area.
as this group grew, they understood that they may not be only used in Europe, but also in Africa and even Asia. And so were operatives of this new Special Forces organization, which were then poised to be able to assist the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and its government to resist against communist influence within their country. Beginning in the late 1950s, the Special Forces began to deploy troops clandestinely to begin with to try to provide intelligence for the South Vietnamese government against communist forces. The North Vietnamese communists began to infiltrate not only cadre and soldiers and political personnel, but also weapons and supplies through Laos and Cambodia to get around the demilitarized zone boundary between the two countries and to infiltrate them into the South to help start a large insurgency.
Special Forces had a long history in Southeast Asia. In July of 1959, 12 U.S. Special Forces teams from the 77th Special Group were sent to Laos. Their mission, to clandestinely organize and train the Laotian Army. At that time, Laos was involved in a brutal civil war, while North Vietnamese forces were using the country's border regions as a logistics base for operations in South Vietnam. The Green Berets arrived in the country wearing civilian clothes with fake identification. They were paid out of civilian funds from CIA bank accounts. Though it had a king, a government, and an army, and could be found on a map, Laos did not really exist. Many of its estimated 2 million people would be astonished to be called Laotians, since they know themselves to be Male or Black Thai or Kalom tribesmen. It is a land without a railroad, a single paved highway, or a newspaper. Its chief cash crop is opium. Laos was dreamed up by French diplomat Jean Chauvel, who in 1946 was France's Secretary General of Foreign Affairs. At the time, France was trying to reassert its authority in Indochina, whose rebellious inhabitants had no desire to return to their pre-war status as colonial subjects. In place of original Indochina, consisting of various kingdoms and principalities, Paris put together 3 new autonomous states within the French Union: Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Drawing lines on a map, Chauvel created Laos by merging the rival kingdoms of Luang Prabang, whose monarch became King of Laos, with Champasak, whose pretender was consoled by being made permanent Inspector General of the new state. French influence did not survive long after the 1954 defeat at Dien Bien Phu. When the French declared Laos independent, it did not have cohesive government. 2 Laotian provinces were run by the communist Pathet Lao under Prince Souphanouvong. His half-brother, Prince Souphanouvong, was chosen premier in 1956, and Souphanouvong and his provinces came under the control of the fledgling central government. A subsequent national election increased communist strength in the National Assembly to 9 of the 21 seats. The U.S. government was not pleased. The United States distrusted Souphanouvong, both as a neutralist and a compromiser with the Reds. The new dictator, the right-wing General Phumi Nosavana, invited U.S. military advisors, who arrived with both U.S. Defense Department and CIA personnel. CIA-led covert action in Laos was the largest paramilitary operation in the history of the agency.
The United States Army Special Forces troops deployed to first South Vietnam and then began to move into Laos and Cambodia. First is not only an intelligence mission, but also to help train some of the indigenous personnel or people who live there to help locate the communists, to find where their trails and cadres were located, their camps, and then to help destroy them or lead government troops into the location.
For more than 13 years, the agency directed native forces that fought major North Vietnamese units to a standstill. International accords guaranteeing the neutrality of Laos had been ignored by the North Vietnamese since the day they were signed. And by the mid-60s, The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was estimated to have some 35,000 NVA troops more or less permanently in place within Laos. Some were engaged in maintaining the famous Ho Chi Minh supply line through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, while a considerable number were conducting ground operations in the northern parts of Laos. This situation was placing unacceptable pressures on the Royal Laotian government and obviously on the Allied forces in South Vietnam, who were the recipients of the men, arms, and munitions which traveled south along the trail. The U.S. government established Project 404, sometimes referred to as Palace Dog, a system whereby military personnel could be in the black in that technically they were not in Laos. Individuals in Project 404 were assigned to units outside Laos, and their in-country existence was classified for most of the time period. Being in the black allowed service personnel to perform military duties as a civilian operating in Laos under the supervision of the military attachés to the U.S. ambassador to Laos. A number of separate military efforts were established under Project 404. Military advisors were assigned to Laotian loyalist and Thai mercenary forces. The Raven Forward Air Controller Network was set up to control U.S. air support to the ground troops. In a brief letter to his wife in Texas, Captain Joseph Kerr Bush Jr., the U.S. Army element of the Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group, mentions his feelings about his tour of duty in Laos.
My darling Mick, today has been another long day at Mang Su, Laos, but at least it's ended and I'm that much closer to being with you and Robin once again. You know, I actually enjoy this tour of duty so long as I'm busy enough to keep my thoughts from wandering back to you. Our mission's classified, but I do think we are making a difference. Captain Joe Bush, Advisor to Laotian Forces, Mang Su, Laos.
In addition to training, these teams were also ordered to find a way to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail that ran through Laos into South Vietnam. This was the main supply route for the Viet Cong. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a single route south, but a spiderweb of trails and footpaths that communist forces used to supply cadres throughout Southeast Asia. By 1961, the political situation in Laos had reached a boiling point. Fighting between communist insurgents, competing warlords, and ethnic struggles, with their roots going back generations, coups and counter-coups were beginning to unhinge American foreign policy in Southeast Asia. According to the domino theory, President Kennedy had to do something about Laos. Early in 1961, U.S. Special Forces were officially admitted into Laos. They could wear their uniforms and were designated by U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group Laos, or MAG Laos, as White Star Mobile Training Teams.
Special Forces were sent to Laos as part of an operation called White Star. And I think that that's probably where they got the early lessons learned, if you will, for what would become their role in Vietnam. The first groups that went in were under civilian cover, and they were just supposed to look around and see what they found. They found the obvious, which was that the communists were all over the country, that there was going to be a real problem. And the Special Forces then went in as part of the Kennedy administration's military commitment to Laos, and I don't have all the details on what the numbers were for that. There was still a limited amount of Special Forces that went in as trainers, and the sort of things that became the rule in Vietnam.
The White Star teams were the spearhead of the fighting force in Laos, and they would ultimately be sucked into Vietnam. The teams were charged with instructing Laotian troops in counterinsurgency tactics. Not all activity took place in the classroom. Some teams provided in-the-field assistance in the form of communication services, intelligence gathering, and creating strike forces among Laos' minority Hill people. This last mission was the lasting contribution of the White Star teams. In late 1961, the Pathet Lao controlled the strategic Bolavens Plateau in southern Laos. Ka Hill people mostly inhabited this area in the Laotian Panhandle region. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran between the plateau and Vietnamese border. The mission of the Green Berets was to organize, arm, and train the Ka tribesmen into guerrilla bands that could drive the Pathet Lao off the plateau and cut the trail. The Special Forces advisors often found themselves in the middle of some of the most desperate fighting in all of the war. These desperate fights were the first trial by fire of the young Berets. They also etched the first names into the black granite wall that would become the stark symbol of America's sacrifice in Southeast Asia.
Dear Mick, only 2.5 more months to go. From all that's happening in little Laos, it seems that I will keep quite busy. It looks like I will have 6 new ribbons on my uniform when I come home. All of that's classified, but if all of the paperwork gets completed, I will receive a little recognition for a generally thankless job. They want me to extend my tour, but baby, I have to get out of this place. Don't worry, old Joseph will be home to his wife and daughter as planned, even if I have to swim the Pacific. Your own, Joe.
Captain Joseph Kerr Bush Jr., military advisor to Laotian forces, was killed during an NVA commando attack 5 days after writing to his wife. He was 25 years old. His name appears on the wall in Washington on panel 32W, line 3. The White Star teams were never able to cut the supply lines in Laos. Had they been allowed to go after the enemy operation bases, the story of the war in Laos and Vietnam might have played out differently.
Again, there were 2 wars going on, and the center of gravity for the main force war is the base areas. And in any war situation, you have to go for the center of gravity. We didn't do it. Center of gravity for the insurgency is the infrastructure. We waited too long to go after it. If we'd done those 2 things early on, it would have been a much different war than it turned out to be.
By 1962, the U.S. reached an agreement with the Communists to stabilize the situation in Laos. This agreement ended any hope of cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and gave free access to supplies to Communist forces in the South for the next decade. Those supplies would be used to end the lives of over 55,000 young Americans. By 1960, Viet Cong insurgency in South Vietnam had begun to grow at an increasing rate. The Viet Cong were battle-hardened veterans. Some had fought this type of war on this same ground against both the Japanese and the French colonial army. For U.S. forces, this was going to be a very different war from the one they had spent a decade training for.
We were now in Vietnam. It was a counterinsurgency. The enemy was hidden. The enemy didn't fight from fixed installations. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. The enemy fought at night. The American forces didn't fight at night. All of the things that we had been taught about fighting an enemy that was on a European battlefield, particularly for an armor officer, it didn't work in Vietnam.
But there was one group of U.S. warriors ready for the coming fight.
But there is also part of the groundswell within the Kennedy administration is over this new notion of counterinsurgency. And the obvious choice for counterinsurgency are warriors who are sort of like the insurgents themselves. In this case, it's the Green Berets, the Special Forces. So there's a very public push in 1960, mostly at the beginning, within the Kennedy administration to send Special Forces to Vietnam to fight the guerrilla as a guerrilla, if you will. And the perception of the war began to change with the reality on the ground, which in this case was, this is a fairly, 1960, a low-level guerrilla war with insurgents that are very much able to stay away from the main force, South Vietnamese units, and do a lot of damage and gain a lot of support within the countryside. Special forces were seen as a way to try to get to thwart that. And the idea was, exactly as they had been planned in Europe, to send them behind enemy lines, in this case just into the countryside in Vietnam, and to try to garner support for the government by living with the people, offering programs that would make their lives better, and at the same time training them to defend themselves.
Just months after President Kennedy's visit to Fort Bragg, the Special Forces was in Vietnam to implement a CIA plan to stem the Viet Cong tide in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The program was called Civilian Irregular Defense Group, CIDG program. The goal of this operation was to deny the VC access to food, supplies, recruits, and intelligence. They hoped to block the North Vietnamese Army access into Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was the rejected agency proposal from Laos. The highlands were inhabited primarily by an assortment of minority groups and primitive tribes, collectively called the Montagnards, mountain people. The Vietnamese people thought they were savages and held the Montagnards in great contempt. This distrust would hinder counterinsurgency in the highlands, which is exactly what the CIA intended to do.
They began to work with some very primitive peoples. They began to work with people such as the Montagnards and the Raids and other tribesmen in the boundary areas between Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. They used these local people, many of whom hated the other tribe or the other racial group. They hired them as basically mercenaries, or they raised organizations, and they were able to operate, you see, within Laos and Cambodia very easily. These were people who lived in the jungle. That was their part of the planet. They were very familiar with it. They were not scared of the jungle. They could work in it very obviously, not only to live, but to hunt and to make war if necessary.
In the beginning, I think is the early 60s, part of the mission of the Green Berets was, to go to the hills, to meet with these tribes, and to try to convince them to support the government of South Vietnam. But as you approach the Montagnards and you talk to them about the government, they would say, what government? You mean that guy who comes and steals my water buffalo? Taxes. And the Montagnards had seen too much of it, the VC running through. And they were largely, like so many people in Vietnam, victimized by the VC run through, and if you don't give us rice, if you don't let us use your facilities, what facility? Basically water, food and water, then you're our enemy. Well, then the RVNs come in, the South Vietnamese army comes in and sees that, and even the American army comes in and sees that, and they're suddenly guilty of harboring the enemy. They didn't harbor the enemy. Same thing we learned later in years in El Salvador and in Central America. The peasants were victimized by the war like that. But the Montagnards were especially strong people.
The CIDG program was run by the CIA and American Special Forces and was loosely connected to the Strategic Hamlet program. Although the program was conceived and funded by the CIA, the strategy and operation fell to the Green Beret.
And so through the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Special Forces mission began to grow.
In November of 1961, 2 Special Forces A-teams were deployed from the 1st Special Forces Group. The A-team established a base in an area and began to win the trust of the local villagers. They then helped them prepare a defense system against the local Cong cadre and NVA forces. The Green Berets also recruited and trained local men to form a strike force designed to provide full-time offensive pressure. The locals would provide reinforcements to area villages under attack, patrol trails, and set ambushes for the VC. Once the Special Forces had established an effective strike force, they would begin to organize and train village defenses. These groups received basic training in weapons handling and were taught to defend and fortify their homes. They fought only when their village was under attack. Each village was provided with a radio that allowed them to contact the Green Berets and the local strike force. The strategy was simple, the results remarkable, and the heroism of both the Green Berets and the mountain people unmatched. The degree of the heroism was demonstrated in places like Pleiku.
The guys at Pleiku saw it the worst. They were working with the Montagnards. They ran out of ammunition. And they're throwing rocks They're throwing anything they could find. If there was a coat hanger on the ground, it got put to use.
The Special Forces had established a base of operations near a strategic branch of the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
I think that was the ultimate goal, was to try to get in there and probably within 4 to 5 months have something in there, like a fixed fire base or a road or something. Well, we continued to gather intelligence, and we continued to get shot at.
The U.S. troops and their Yard Strike Force were determined to cut this enemy supply line. The VC and the NVA were just as determined not to let this happen.
They had discipline, they wore uniforms, they would stand and fight.
The Viet Cong and NVA regulars assaulted the Green Beret fire base with a fury unseen to date in the war. This was no longer guerrilla warfare, it was an old-fashioned siege.
They were under siege, I believe, it was 89 days. And they were just swamped by swarms.
The small strike force called in every asset they had. When bad weather grounded their air support, the Green Berets called on sheer guts alone to hold out.
And they held out. They held out. That was nasty. But you're talking like, I can recall, I don't believe I slept for 2 months one time, if that's possible. I mean, I did lie down, hugging my weapon all the time. But if you can sleep with one eye open, I did it.
It's just the idea when you see what I saw and all of these soldiers fighting gallantly. I mean, I don't want to get overly excited and teary, but these were kids.
Bloody and battered, the Green Berets and their Yard Strike Force held out and broke the back of the assaulting Cong. The success of the A-teams was so extraordinary that by April 1962, 40 villages in Darlak province were under the protection of the CIDG program. In May 1962, 8 more teams were ordered to Vietnam. By July, the CIA was so pleased with their success that the agency requested 16 more teams for deployment. But if the agency was pleased, the communists were not. They so feared and respected the Special Forces warriors that they even resorted to offering bounties to villagers and guerrilla fighters to stop the Berets. You didn't even have to turn in a whole American to collect the bounty.
We compared it to a $10,000 bounty. If you bring me the head of a Green Beret, you get $10,000. So there was that constant concern about not losing your head.
Overall, the CIDG program was operating very well. In just 1 year, the Special Forces and their Montagnards forces had denied the Viet Cong access to the local population and the resources of food and shelter. But sometimes the enemy was closer than they expected.
Up around Pleiku, I had some buddies who were sent in there. They weren't Special Forces, they were Signal Corps. They were to build a communications tower. And they were on TDY, temporary duty. And there about 4 months. And for 4 months, there was a Vietnamese lady in the camp who would wash their clothes, cook them special foods, bring them special favors. And when they left, when they were to return to wherever their base was outside of Vietnam, they were in the back of a 3/4-ton truck, and as they pulled away, she came running up to them with a gift. And she handed them the gift, and it was a grenade, and it went off. And so this is after like months of Mama Son being the one to take care of it, make your coffee. So it says that they were in place. They were in place for a long time, and they were everywhere. And identifying them was literally impossible. Even in camps where it was considered secure, they generally knew that among some of the nationals, some of those nationals were VC.
Sadly, the powers in Washington could not stand their own success. They were about to order a change to special operations in Vietnam that would alter the Shadow Warriors' mission and the nature of the war. As the size and effectiveness of the CIDG continued to grow, the Joint Chiefs began to doubt that the CIA had the personnel and resources to manage all the Special Forces troops now in the country. Though the Special Forces operations continued to win hearts and minds, Washington made a fatal decision. They switched tactical command of the Green Beret operations from the CIA to MAC-V. Once MAC-V had command of the CIDG program, the mission began to change. For both the Special Forces troops and the local strike force, the change was for the worst. MAC-V understood neither the nature of special operations nor the requirements of counterinsurgency. From the beginning, MAC-V viewed the Berets' involvement in the CIDG program as too static.
Well, in '64 actually is when it begins. There's a decision to use Special Forces as a long-range reconnaissance function, and it takes two basic forms. The first form is the Greek teams, if you will, the Sigma and Omega teams, which are rather large, fairly large groups of 25 Special Forces with hatchet teams to back them up, which were indigenous CIDGs. It could be as large as 100. And what they would do is they would go into enemy base areas inside South Vietnam, usually on reconnaissance missions, but they were big enough that they could handle any trouble. And if they needed, they could call on air support artillery or these hatchet teams to back them up. And they did that a lot, particularly in the southern Central Highlands and in the Three Corps region, well west of Saigon, over on the Cambodian border. And then also in '64, there is the formations of the Studies and Observations Group, which is SOG, which becomes quite famous. It's a covert arm, cross-border arm of SOG. Most basically, there are other forces, other services involved in it, but it's mostly Special Forces.
In effect, these SOG teams had to fight with one hand tied behind their backs.
The prohibition against American operations in Laos and Cambodia and North Vietnam is counterproductive. You just can't fight a war that way. Normally, you would have sent reconnaissance elements, big reconnaissance elements, in an overt way into the base areas in Laos, and then you would have invaded them if you found the army. But that's off limits, so SOG has to do that. So it's a covert operation. Special Forces with very large limitations on them are allowed in certain areas of Laos to start out with, and Cambodia later on. Laos beginning in '65. Cambodia beginning in '66, to search out the base areas, get intelligence, and call in airstrikes.
As a result, the Green Berets were removed from the role of administering the CIDG program and reassigned to providing surveillance along the Cambodian and Laotian borders. Now, the Shadow Warriors would conduct offensive missions against the belly of the beast, Viet Cong support bases.
We were basically going into their territory and saying, we can play this game too.